This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. ASL is not a monolith. In fact, many distinct dialects have emerged due to. I'm going to start over, sorry. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. ASL is not a monolith. In fact, many distinct dialects have emerged due to geographical separation. Black American Sign Language, or BASL, is one of them. It diverged from American Sign Language in the late 19th century due to school segregation. While the two languages share many similarities, BASL has some distinct features, many of which have been documented by scholars Carolyn McCaskill and Joseph Hill. They, alongside two other researchers, have been exploring the rich history of Black ASL since 2007. Carolyn is the director of the Center for Black Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University and a professor of deaf studies. And Joseph is an associate professor of ASL and Interpreting Education at Rochester Institute of Technology. We're also joined today by interpreters Candas, Ifama Barnes, and JaRon Gilchrist, who will be interpreting for Carolyn and Joseph, respectively. Carolyn and Joseph, welcome to Embodied.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as a reminder, we are recording a video version of the show, which will be available on our show page, embodiedwunc.org, where you can also find a full transcript of this conversation. So, Carolyn, we spoke earlier in the show about the deep history of ASL throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. But I'd love to go back to the mid 1800s and talk about what happened after the Civil War when the first schools started to emerge for Black deaf people. What did sign education for Black deaf students look like in that period?
Back then, when schools were segregated, America really had a total of 18 Black deaf schools that were segregated, including the Kendall School for the Deaf in Washington, D.C. And some of those schools that were segregated had what we called Negro and colored departments on the same campuses. Some of those Black deaf school students were on campuses with white deaf students, but they were segregated in the dorms. They may have even slept together in the dorms, but they actually were segregated for their education. Around 1869, there was the first Black deaf school, and there were many more that were added after that. And then Georgia Deaf, correction to the interpretation, Louisiana School for the Deaf was not desegregated until 1978. It was the last one. I actually went to the Alabama School for the Negro Deaf back in 1964. And I know that I don't look like I went to school that long ago. Yes, snaps up for me, but I did. I went to a Black deaf school that was segregated from 64, and then it was integrated with the white deaf school in 1968. And for a long time, I often thought about not really sharing my experience with a lot of different people because I thought that, well, I was embarrassed about what happened at the time. And it wasn't until I started working on my PhD and I shared with one of my professors about my experience, and she was absolutely shocked because she had never heard about the stories of these segregated institutions. And that helped me think about possible topics to write about, and that's how we came up with the research study on Black American Sign Language. And I decided to share my experience, and with my colleagues, I shared it with Dr. Seal Lucas, and we started working on a project to do research on Black American Sign Language. And we were very fortunate to receive support from the Spencer Foundation and the National Science Foundation to help us with our research. We were very fortunate to have Dr. Joseph Hill to join us on our research team. And one other person that was with us was Robert, and the four of us worked together as the research team for Black ASL.
So, Joseph, I want to talk with you about BASL and some of the findings that emerged for you all from doing this research project. But first, can you talk a bit about what some of the primary linguistic differences are between BASL and ASL?
Sure, sure. Carolyn just mentioned there were about 18 Black institutions for deaf students. And for this study, we only selected six different places we visited. And for that group that we observed, a lot of them were older deaf speakers that actually went to those segregated schools. And some of them were from mainstream schools. And we noticed the commonalities with those people in our studies. For example, the phonological features with one-handed signs versus two-handed signs. For example, the sign for want, having the hands up and moving towards the chest, that's typically signed with two hands. And that's something that we found in the ASL dictionary, the sign for want signed that way, under the expectation that it was all signed the same. But in this course, you notice that one hand is dropped, and that one-handed sign for want is still accepted. So there's some variations there with the one-handed versus two-handed signs. And what's interesting is looking at Black deaf people in our study, they typically use two hands often compared to white deaf people in the study. It was a huge difference that we noticed. Another example could be the location of the signs related to the area near the head. Some signs like no, you have the hand shaped in a certain way, touching the temple of the head. That's the sign for no. And then again, we've noticed that the location, it was moved down to the cheek or chin, and sometime even below the chin. So that was a variation, again, depending on the interaction or the location. Again, that was another finding that we noticed with Black deaf people. They tend to sign with their signs further up on the head in location compared to white deaf individuals who tend to drop those signs. So we noticed a more consistent way of signing that with the signs closer towards the head. Also, the framework of signing. Notice sometimes Black deaf people sign bigger outside of the box, where white signers typically sign in a smaller space. There are variations with that when it comes to age. In the language policy set, how that influenced their signing practices. So we noticed that white younger signers sign bigger compared to older white signers, which is more contained in more of a smaller space. And so those were some of the features that we found on the Black deaf side. Also, another thing that we've noticed is the vocabulary use within sign language, especially within different states. In those that attended Black deaf residential schools, it's different. It's not part of the ASL variation. It's quite different. Like, for example, the sign for chicken or bathroom, we noticed these distinctive different signs in these different states. And that had a huge influence based on segregation. Another type of vocabulary that we noticed that was emerging was the use of African American Vernacular English, AAVE, as it's abbreviated also. That was something that was emerging quite often. And that's typically with the younger generation, which makes sense because a lot of them did not go to Black deaf segregated schools or residential schools. A lot of them attended mainstream schools, and they were a part of the Black hearing community where AAVE was used, in which they included that within their sign language. Um, so that's another example that we found.
I want to talk about the moment in history when BASL and ASL came back together more formally in education settings. This was when schools were integrated. And Carolyn, you were part of the first integrated class at the Alabama School for the Deaf in 1968. Tell me a bit about that transition for you from going from an environment where you were with just other Black deaf students to going to this integrated school where folks were not speaking BASL.
Right. That period of transition for me was really was a blessing in disguise. It was a blessing for me because of the ability to receive a quality education. Whereas in the Black deaf school, we didn't receive the best education in terms of college preparatory material. It was more vocational training us to have future work and future jobs as hairstylists and beauticians, working in wood shops or cleaning and that kind of work. It wasn't academic preparation. Additionally, in the Black deaf schools, we were allowed to sign, while in some of the white deaf programs switched to an oral program. And so Black deaf students were not required to learn speech, where many of the residential schools for the deaf were required to do so. So that was one of the things that was fortunate for us. In a way, we talk about deaf gain, and the deaf gain that happened was that our language was valued. Now, when I transitioned to the white deaf school, I had an opportunity to learn more, and I realized the differences in the white deaf school versus the Black deaf school. And that's where I became kind of shocked. My signing was so different, and their signing was so different. And that was because we weren't even far from each other, maybe 15 or 20 minutes away, but we were so segregated. It was interesting to see how the language emerged in those segregated schools and how their signing was so different. In the Black deaf school, we were so intimate. We had to figure out how to navigate the world differently. But we were young back then. And we learned, and I picked up the way that the white folks signed, and I learned how to code switch. And I didn't even know the meaning of this word code switching back then. I didn't even know it was a word. But in order to survive in the environment with the white deaf students, I acquired the language that they were using and their style of signing. And my good friend one day said, Carolyn, you're signing different. And I was thinking to myself, really, am I signing different? And I realized that I had assimilated to a white deaf way of signing, and I began to code switch. So when I was with white deaf folks, I signed their way. When I was with Black deaf folks, I signed the way that I was used to signing in that community. So that was a lesson for me about how Black deaf people learn how to code switch without even knowing that that's what we're doing. We do what we have to do to survive in the environment that we're in. And I think that that was important.
Joseph, I know that you heard that theme of code switching a lot in your conversations with folks around the South about their experiences of the ASL. Can you talk a bit about how those threads come through to today? What messages do students get in academic settings about their use of BASL? How recognized and affirmed is it for them?
Sure. I feel I'm really fortunate to be a part of this team and publish this work, also to create the documentary where people get a visual of our work so they can see it for themselves in the book and in the film. Those resources that we created, plus the resources others have created now, are available in schools where teachers and professors are happy to have that sort of material in a way they can incorporate into their curriculum, into their teaching. A lot of Black deaf students in the classroom feel like they have something that they can connect to, something that they belong to. Their background is something that they feel really connected to. And before, it wasn't a lot of available resources pertaining to this work. So we've noticed a change in that. And to have real life data from different schools, for example, K-12, K through 12, how did it change for them? I can tell you based on my experience working in the university, where we have Black deaf students, I can see a lot of them coming with more awareness of Black ASL. They seem to be more knowledgeable about it and aware of Black deaf people in other areas, and the signing styles, how that can be different, and opening up that lined up discussion. And sometimes linguistic discussions about how these conversations in vocabulary and concepts can vary and stem conversation and linguistic differences and really spark conversation. And also, it's a sense of proudness, a sense of pride to have that language as well.
Yeah, Carolyn, you
Let
have
me
thoughts?
weigh in.
Sure.
In addition to what Dr. Hill just said, our work actually validated the existence of a culture and a language. And when we explained to people, when we visited these different states in the South, like Alabama, and we went to Richmond, Virginia, and to Hampton, Virginia, to New Orleans, to Raleigh, North Carolina, Little Rock, Arkansas, these 6 different places that we visited. And when we completed our interviews and published the book, and we came back and shared our findings, many of the Black deaf people, they began to cry. They wept because they were so moved and happy that they thought, who am I? And they realized that this is my language and it's beautiful. And there's a history behind it and there's a culture behind it. And when we explained that, it validated it for people that you are somebody, that you have something that's special and unique and a history that's worth sharing with the world. And the world needs to know about our history, our language, and our culture. And I agree with what Dr. Hill said, that really validated for all of us to be proud of who we are.
And to piggyback off what Carolyn said, Dr. McCaskill, I'm sorry, that's right. It's not just the younger generation of Black deaf, it's also the older generation. A lot of them are in our study, have said the same thing. Once we completed the interviews and we conducted our findings, just seeing how their perspectives shifted. And after working with them and having these discussions and how our work validated a lot of that for them.
I'd love to talk about moving forward.
This is Carolyn. May I step in for a moment?
Oh, sure.
I just wanted to say that I'm so excited to see some of the discussion on social media that's happening now. I can see more and more people who are doing research on Black ASL because there's not a lot. There's so much more that needs to be done. Our team maxed out, and I actually just officially retired. I am now a retiree, and there's so much more to be done. And my work is basically done at this point. but I can see opportunities for more and more people to be able to do their studies on this. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Congratulations on your retirement. And I want to build
Thank you.
on, yeah, I want to build on those reflections about how young folks are opening up about BASL on TikTok, on Instagram, how they are still continuing to create new signs and really making BASL their own. At the same time that there is an ongoing conversation about emerging technology and how that is shaping the experiences of deaf folks. Just earlier this year, there was a report about the first use of gene therapy for kids born deaf. I'm curious to hear from both of you what your hopes are for the linguistic future of Black deaf folks and BASL in light of some of the emerging technologies and conversations about language that are being had at the same time. Joseph, I'll start with you.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Like you talked about emerging technology, especially social media, where we're sharing language and, as you mentioned, the gene therapy. But I think social media in particularly is coming right on time for people to start sharing their languages, their thoughts about culture, um, something that hasn't really been shown before. And oftentimes we tend to have these in smaller settings, one-on-one conversations, maybe even in the classroom. But this really changes the game, allowing individuals to share, and people can follow their work, whether it's experiences they had or languages they want to share themselves or their family. Um, it really validates themselves as a Black deaf person to have their own linguistic experiences. So we're excited to see more and more growth from that and more people conducting more studies and gathering more information in a way to preserve language and culture. With the gene therapy, that's something that's not new. That's been ongoing for a while. It's a kind of interference or something that says, hey, we need to fix this gene, we need to fix you. That's not new. That has been the case from a while ago. Technology, for example, we had the cochlear implant. Uh, that's another thing where a lot of views on that was we had to fix this person. A lot of doctors and medical expertise felt like they had to interfere and fix a deaf person. And it did impact deaf culture in a lot of ways as it relates to identity as a deaf person, in language production, in education practices. A lot of those things have changed. And still, I'm 44 years old now, and what I've seen in my lifetime is a change. At the same time, a lot of things are the status quo. Culture is still here, language is still here. So, in a way, people are aware of what they need for themselves. Um, do I need to change him or do I need to change this? But what about me? How do I validate myself? What do I need? Let me work towards that. Language and culture, community, all of those things are still around. And what the future looks like with gene therapy really depends on how us as people really preserve and protect our language. So it's hard to predict the future and the impact to the Black deaf community as it relates to language and culture, but that's how I feel about it.
Carolyn, I'd love to end with any closing reflections from you about your hopes for the linguistic future of BASL.
I'm hoping that more and more people will do more stories and more documentaries about our community, our culture, and our language. In the past few years, There's one young Black deaf woman who has been posting on TikTok
Yes, I've seen this.
with stories. And I was very happy to see that. Sadie Smith was doing that, and it's been wonderful to see her talk about her grandmother and those kinds of things. And as I said, we focused on the South. We didn't focus on the North at all or the East, but I'm sure that they were Black ASL features and norms there as well. But I'm hoping that people will continue to do the research, to do videos, to do more interviews, and to continue the work. I am very positive that that's going to happen because I see the excitement. The more we share what's going on, the more excited people get. And there's more passion and more support of the work.
I've been talking with doctors Carolyn McCaskill and Joseph Hill. Carolyn is the director of the Center for Black Deaf Studies at Gallaudet University and a professor of deaf studies. Joseph is an associate professor of ASL and Interpreting Education at Rochester Institute of Technology. Thank you both so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having us.
I really appreciated you giving us an opportunity to share our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you also to Candas, Ifama Barnes, and JaRon Gilchrist for their interpretation. You can find out more about everyone we talked to today at our website, embodiedwunc.org. You can find all episodes of Embodied, the radio show there, and check out our weekly podcast. In addition to the audio format of this show, we're also recording a video of this episode that you can find available at our website. We will link to it at wunc.org. Today's episode was produced by Paige Miranda and edited by Amanda Magnus. Kaya Finlay and Gabriella Glick also produced for our show. Skylar Chadwick is our intern, and Jenny Lawson is our technical director. North Carolina Public Radio is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.